Happy Limes anniversary! 4 years ago today, my Limes concept was born as part of the kickoff to a very special annual event, Michelle Lupton's Case Me a Christmas Card series, and I'm so excited that she's asked me again to help her kick it off this year. LIMES is an acronym that just helps you think about how to take an inspiration piece and make it your own. It works with cards or photos or pretty much anything, and it gives you some ideas for putting your own spin on whatever it is that inspired you. As always, I had fun going through Michelle's Instagram grid to find a card to use as my inspiration, and I landed on this one. It's adorable and funny with that punny sentiment. So let's just take a minute to break it down. First, let's look at the colors. Michelle has some mid-tone, not quite pastel pink, yellow, green, and blue, along with a big white border and pops of black in the stamped images and sentiment. For techniques, she stamped the ducks and the sentiment. I think she probably die cut those little rectangles, and then she colored and fussy cut the ducks, since I don't see a white edge around them. For the elements, she's got a grid as a background, obviously the monochromatic ducks, and the mix of these gives kind of a pop art feel to the card. Her sentiment is a pun, and it's taking the place of a couple of the ducks right on the grid. I love a grid, and I love the idea of a second kind of grid on top of the grid background, but I'm definitely less about the critters. Let's see how it goes. For the first card, I created a grid out of circles. I used this mini slimline cover plate die to cut my larger circles to be the backers, and then I used a little circle die with a snowflake type shape cut out of it to layer on top. This snowflake circle is part of a big Christmas set from Holtz that totally intimidates me, and it's going to be the subject of an upcoming video, so look out for that. I kept the little snowflake cutouts to add back in later, but first I added color to all my circles. I'm building a grid of 16. It's 4x4, and I've got 4 colors, so I know I need 4 of each color for the larger circle and for the snowflake circle. I pressed the die cuts down into the ink pads, and I did all the pink first, trying to keep my fingers clean as possible so I didn't get a lot of cross-contamination. I moved on through the yellow, then the blue, and finally the green. Then I spent some time figuring out my grid. I wanted to have all the colors spaced out, and honestly, I spent quite a bit of time on it. But somewhere along the way, things got mixed up, and you'll see that the card is different in the end. As I laid them out, I was thinking they're so pretty, almost like little macarons with these pastel colors. When it came time to glue them together, I added liquid glue to the larger circle, and then I placed the snowflake circle on top, got it in position as best as I could, and then I added in the little white snowflake. I could have left out the snowflake for a different look, but I would have had to be more careful with the glue. Then I simply popped up all my little circles directly onto a white card base. I added some iridescent pearl sequins in the middle of each snowflake, and I added a die-cut joy sentiment from Avery all over in the correct position, using one of the little snowflakes as the tittle for my J. Okay, let's compare. I have the colors, except for black. I have 2 layers on each piece of my grid to get that two-tone look, but I modified the grid to be made up of circles, and I die-cut my sentiment rather than stamping it. But it is in the same place. Of course, this is a Christmas card and Michelle's isn't. I excluded black, stamping, fussy cutting, and coloring. No ducks, of course, and no joke or pun. For my spin, of course, my card is a 4 1/4 inch square, my favorite. For the next card, I created a grid in a different way, and I used completely different colors than Michelle's. I started by creating 2 panels of red cardstock, one in a mid-tone red and one in a brighter oranger red. I prefer doing this to keeping colored cardstock on hand. It saves me having to find a place to store it and keep track of the scraps. I'm going to cut these with this paper rose die, but first I spritz some Altenew shimmer spray over the panels and then some gold watercolor splatter. I assembled my grid by adding some glue to a panel of white cardstock and then putting the squares on. My math for the size of the panel is obviously wrong for a 5x5 grid, so it was too big. Looks like I had it correct for a 6x6 grid though. I alternated my squares between the 2 reds, and I really just tried to push them as close together as possible to keep everything straight and properly positioned. I used a glue runner for this because you can lift up the squares and replace them if you need to. And then I trimmed the whole thing down with my trimmer. Now the problem here is that I didn't want to trim into the red at all, but I was left with some narrow white edges, so I just dipped those into one of the red ink pads so that it wouldn't be quite so noticeable. Then as a final step, I ran the panel through my die cutting machine with no dies, just the plates, and this flattened everything together and really squished it down into that backing panel. Now I don't have a duck, but I do have a dove, so I decided to make this Christmas card with a bird to stick close to the inspiration. This is an old dove die from Ellen Hudson, and the one thing I like to do to add interest to the simple shape is to cut out a second wing and then put it behind the first wing with some foam tape. Some dove dies actually come with this second wing, and I think that's where I got the idea. It just adds a bit of dimension, which I think is pretty. Another thing I like to do is add some clear stickles to the edges of the wings and also to the top of my CZ Designs piece die cut sentiment. I'm just about out of these Stardust stickles, which are one of my old favorites. It's a great mess way free to get a glittery look without having to deal with cleanup. I like to put some down on the edges and then kind of smear it around a bit with my fingers to give it more of a random organic look. To add it to the wings, boy, it was dumb to glue them together before I added the stickles. So I grabbed a piece of scrap paper and I put it between the wings so I could add the stickles to the front wing and smear them around a little. Then it was easy to take the paper away and add more to the back wing. And I didn't do much else to this card. It's already got sparkle from the shimmer spray and gold splatter, as well as the stickles on the front. For this one, well, I've got a grid with a big white border around it, and I've got a bird. But I changed the colors completely, and I only have one bird. I could have made my grid with the 4 colors to make it look more like the inspiration, but I think the red feels more like Christmas and more like me. My sentiment is moved down. This bird maybe is a little too big for this grid. You can't see much of it, but I feel that the chunkiness of the bird is well matched with the sentiment, which is also chunky. I excluded any stamping or fussy cutting and a joke. In my final card, I used yet another way to create a grid, and that's with this Rows of Squares 3D embossing folder from Altenew. I lined it up so that the grid would be straight and centered on my panel, and I ran it through my machine. Now, I generally don't spritz my cardstock before I use a 3D embossing folder. I really should have with this one. The dimension on this is really remarkable, and I can see that I do have a couple of little cracks. My original plan was that I would use these new little lights from Lawn Fawn as my colored bits on each square on the grid, and I cut a ton of them. Yep, a ton. The lights are 2-layered, so you can add color to the top layer, and then the little hole shows up as a highlight when you glue it to the solid layer behind. I use Copics rather than the ink pads to color these. I just felt like they would give me more control, and I did a mid-tone all over, and then a darker swipe down the left side to give the look of dimension. I made one to be sure that I was happy, and then I sat down to do the job of coloring and gluing 39 of these little suckers. My grid this time is 7 by 7, but the Gold Mary sentiment from Waffle Flower is going to take up about 10 squares. I colored all the top layers, and then I started gluing. I got through pretty much all of the yellows before I even thought about the fact that these lights don't even really look like lights because they don't have that little silver or gold bit on the bottom. You know, the little screw-in part? So I moved away from the full grid idea and I went back to the cover plate die that these little lights come with. And I cut just one string of lights from some Inca Gold cardstock. This is a great way to get more from this cover plate. You can use it as it is with all the strings of lights in the frame, or you can cut out the strings and use them on their own. And that even gives you a frame that you can use separately too. By adding the colored lights onto the gold lights, I'll get those little ends that I'm looking for. What are they called? I glued down the sentiment, and usually I don't put a ton of glue on the back or make sure that it's all over the back of something. But since my background is so bumpy, I want to be sure that there's glue wherever there will be contact. Then I glued the string of lights in place and I left everything to dry. To create my background, I used the same Copic markers, but this time with the chisel tip to create little squares of color all around my mat. This will tie in with the grid, and it'll also add a little bit of color to my card. This is easy to do, but it is important to check every once in a while with your panel to be sure that you're getting enough coverage. It's also important to check that your markers are full and juicy. I had to change my pink out really early since the one I had used on the light bulbs was pretty dry. This is an easy way to incorporate markers into your card making, even if you're not someone who loves to color. And I have a video with some other ideas that I'll link right here. To finish this one, I went back and I added a little script Christmas die cut from scrapbook.com because I felt like there was just too much white space underneath the Mary. And that was a fun discovery. The line weight is about the same as the string of lights, So I line them up to kind of connect the lights to the sentiment. I've got the colors, although they're a little more spread out than on Michelle's card. And again, there's no black. I've got a grid, although I changed the technique for making the grid to a 3D embossing folder. My little elements in the grid are more haphazard and not on every square. I've kind of reversed the colors by making my card predominantly white with colorful highlights. My sentiment is almost in the right place, but it's die cut instead of stamped. I excluded the ducks or birds of any kind, and I didn't do any stamping. As usual, the more cards I made, the further away they got from the inspiration, and that's okay. Inspiration is really just a starting point that helps you get your creativity sparking and over the paralyzing fear of a blank page. I've been using LIMES since 2020, and I've been sharing it as well. If you don't already have it, here's a link to my free LIMES worksheet that gives you some ideas for how to analyze and modify your inspiration and put your own spin on it. Now it's time to head over to see how Michelle was inspired by one of my cards, and then you can keep watching her as she continues casing Christmas cards with a whole bunch of her friends. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.